The cover of a comic book can be a powerful thing. From iconic imagery to illustrations that speak of much larger contexts, comics have done their fair share over the years when it comes to influencing public perceptions. Some stand out more than others though, having played a bigger, more impactful role in history. So today we are breaking down the top 10 shocking comic book covers that changed everything. Get ready for a history lesson, friends. A fun one, of course, because it is comics after all. And at number 10, Action Comics number 1. This is the comic book cover that changed everything in the industry of comics. The first appearance of Superman lifting a motor vehicle in the air as civilians nearby lose their shit. It's an iconic image and there's been plenty of homages made to it. But it's not just the image that carries great meaning, it's the context behind it. To better understand, let's break down the history of comics for a hot second. Superman is often seen as the beginning of comics, or at least the North American superhero trend. And while that latter statement is very true, there was a whole booming art form that existed prior to the Man of Steel's debut. Comics first emerged in the newspapers in the late 1800s, with many historians often giving credit to Richard F. Occult and 1895's The Yellow Kid, the first prominent comic strip to appear in newspapers. From then on, especially in the 1920s, comics explored new artistic grounds and often were quite subversive, used witty political commentary, and were existential as f***. But that all changed with the emergence of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman. This was something readers had never seen before, and while the early Golden Age superheroes did pull a lot of inspiration from pulp heroes of the beginning of the 20th century, it was something startling, innovative, and fascinating, especially during the Great Depression era. Superman was a shining beacon of hope, the epitome of the American dream, the hero that we all strive to be more like. Or at least back then. And at number 9, The Avengers Issue 1. Published in 1963, The Avengers Issue 1, a cover by Jack Kirby, would change the DNA of Marvel Comics forever. While DC had already established their Justice League team 3 years prior, and had superhero teams the likes of Justice Society of America back in the 1940s, The Avengers was Marvel's first superhero team and brought together many of the company's mainstays into one comic. It also is the series responsible for bringing back the Golden Age hero, Captain America, later in issue 4. And it really set the stage for the kind of storytelling readers could expect under the guidance and leadership of Stan Lee. Speaking of Avengers members, in at number 8, Captain America number 1. The cover of Captain America issue 1 is pretty darn famous. Not only is it Cap's debut, but it features the titular hero punching none other than Hitler, square in the face. But at the time of its release, this was an interesting choice, and many see it as a form of political protest from Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. When it came out in 1941, the US had yet to join the war, and the full extent of the crimes that Hitler and the Nazis were committing had yet to be universally acknowledged. But many felt that the US should have gotten involved long before Pearl Harbor, and many comic books featured the likes of superheroes being involved in wartime efforts, from fighting Nazi criminals to encouraging the sales of bonds, although the latter was more so after the US was officially involved. It's also worth noting that there was a lot of harmful racial stereotyping in these early wartime comics, especially against the Japanese, but we'll leave that for another list. And at 7, Green Lantern Green Arrow issue 85. The shocking truth about drugs. That's the tagline that sat atop this famous 1971 comic book cover, featuring the story Snowbirds Don't Fly, the infamous social commentary on the drug problem in the US. It told the tale of Green Arrow's ward, Speedy, becoming addicted to heroin, all as a means to articulate that the disease of addiction does not discriminate. It can happen to anybody. Despite Hal Jordan being a bit of a prick on the cover, it's an incredibly effective image, one that still resonates to this day. Side note, it's post-Comics Code Authority. They normally ban this kind of content, but Marvel was making great strides in using their platform to discuss the danger of narcotics, specifically in the Amazing Spider-Man story in which Harry Osborn struggles with his drug addictions. So by the time DC jumped on board with this story, much of the code's regulations had been diluted, with it nearing its end thanks to PSA-style stories like this one. And at 6, Lobo number 1. Long before DC's spacefaring bounty hunter Lobo hit the scene in 1983, a smaller comics publisher called Dell Comics released this issue, Lobo number 1, in 1965. So why was it a big deal? Because it featured a black man on the cover, and one who was in a heroic position. He was a gunslinger, and the side of the issue read, "Branded for life, an honest man blamed for a crime he did not commit." Now it should go without saying that the US has a pretty terrible and murky history in terms of the treatment of the African American community, and the 60s were a critical time for black rights. So when Dell released this comic, it was considered controversial, but it was important in terms of pushing away from the horrible racial stereotypes in comics and moving towards better representation. Unfortunately, Lobo's series would flounder after only 2 issues thanks to a lack of sales. But hey, at least it was a start. And at number 5, Batgirl issue 41 variant cover. This cover would be majorly important when it came to the perception of how female characters in comics are depicted, or at least pertaining to the discussion of it. Now, we have come a long way since the Women in Refrigerators movement, but there is still a lot of work to be done. That whole issue really blew up and made international news when DC announced the release of this particular variant cover for Batgirl issue 41. It featured the Joker holding Barbara Gordon, aka Batgirl, hostage with tears flooding from her eyes. Many felt that this was distasteful. It was an homage to Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, an iconic graphic novel in which the Joker shot Barbara Gordon, and presumably sexually brutalized her too. Her gun wound injuries inevitably paralyzed her from the waist down. Many saw this as unnecessary. It was trauma created to further the plot of Batman and James Gordon in the story. Barbara, rather than being killed off entirely, was revived as a paraplegic character, fighting crime under the guise of Oracle for years. After the New 52 though, she was given her ability to walk again, and controversy ensued. So by the time this cover came out, Barbara Gordon fans had a whole lot to be pissed off about, and this cover became an object of national discussion, ultimately being recalled. And at number 4, Astonishing X-Men issue 51. Representation for the LGBTQ+ community is pretty darn lacking in comics. Yes, it is getting better and there are more queer characters in the panels of mainstream comics these days, but it's still a fairly small percentage. But instead of looking at the negative, this number looks at the positive, particularly this comic, Astonishing X-Men issue 51. It marks a major moment in striving towards better representation in the future, especially thanks to its cover. It featured the first gay wedding in comics, with the wedding itself appearing on the cover along with a large population of the Marvel Universe watching on, in attendance. The 2012 story followed the events of the wedding between Jean-Paul Beaupierre, aka Northstar, and Kyle Xanadu. Northstar was Marvel's first openly gay character, and the two had been dating since 2009. In 2011, gay marriage became legal in real life in New York, and the following year, the two were married in the comic. Naturally, a lot of critics, a lot of which weren't even really comic book readers, let their Frederick Wortham hang out and responded to this issue with bigoted remarks. But that did not stop it from happening, and it made history. In at 3, the death of Superman. Of course I have to talk about the death of Superman on this list. Look at that cover. So without getting into the whole death of Superman made death irrelevant in comic books argument that I generally dive into when the mere mention of this story event comes up, long story short, it was a terrible money grab with greater industry implications. We're going to talk about why this cover stirred up so much attention from DC readers and Superman fans worldwide. So, prior to the death of Superman's story arc, DC was looking for a way to tie in an event happening in another one of their spin-off properties, the television series Lois and Clark: The Adventures of Superman, starring Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher. The two titular characters were getting married in the show, and as a tie-in promo in the comics, so were their panel counterparts. But in order to prevent the wedding from happening, because apparently superheroes can't get married, a still running faux pas, at least according to DC, something had to happen. And that something was Doomsday, an alien that looks like a Hulk ripoff with spikes, who would engage the Man of Steel in a deathmatch where they punched each other to their graves, or so it seemed. In the long run, neither of them really died. Instead, Doomsday was later proven to still be kicking, and Superman had simply slipped into a Kryptonian coma, a new invention that basically allowed him to look dead and show no vital signs, but was really him re-energizing, as if he were a butterfly in a cocoon. Despite all this, the image of Superman's cape draped over a stick, surrounded by rubble, was a jarring one, along with the multiple variants DC pumped out for the event, including one that resembled a tombstone and one that had his insignia made out of blood. Remember, at the time, readers really believed that Superman had actually been killed off, which was a bold move, but one that would shortly be reversed and cause major outrage. And of course, killing off Superman but bringing him back would change everything in terms of the plot device of killing off and reviving superheroes like it's no big deal. Death of Superman took that from an uncommon occurrence to one that everybody in the industry started doing willy-nilly. And at number 2, Flash of Two Worlds. What's more shocking than Superman's death? Well, not much, except maybe this cover, which at the time of its release was a really big deal, and essentially is the reason why the concept of multiverses in comics exists today. In 1961, Carmine Infantino drew the cover for a Flash issue, issue 123. On it, for the very first time ever, we saw the Flash Barry Allen running side by side with Jay Garrick, the Flash of the Golden Age, who had been retired and loosely retconned out of the DC continuity, along with a handful of other heroes from that era. As the story goes, apparently Infantino and DC editor Julius Schwartz had this running challenge where Infantino would try to draw the most absurd or unimaginable covers, and Schwartz and the writers would then have to come up with stories to match them. In this case, Schwartz came up with the multiverse. kind of a big deal. The success of the story led to DC reviving many of its Golden Age characters, introducing the concept of two Earths, which would then be further expanded by the time Crisis on Infinite Earths hit the scene in 1985. All in all, this is the cover responsible for introducing the idea of the multiverse not only to DC Comics, but to a lot of mainstream audiences in the industry too. And finally, in our number 1 spot, Crime Suspense Stories issue 22. By today's standards, this cover of EC Comics Crime Suspense Stories is by no means controversial. I mean, hell, there have been a slew of homages made to it over the years from all kinds of comic book publishers. But back at the time of its publication, back in 1954, the comic industry was about to enter one of its darkest periods. Or rather, a dark period that was sugarcoated by a bunch of PG, silly, and camp stories that made our beloved Golden Age heroes acceptable for young readers. Let's backtrack a sec. In that same year, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham would publish a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. It claimed that comics were ruining and manipulating the children of America, and while he had no scientific evidence backing up his claims, people really bought into his ideas. He not only took shots against DC's staple trinity of characters, but horror comics and many of the genres outside of the superhero works. Now, just prior to that, a Senate hearing that investigated censorship in comics had begun. One of the comics the Senate hearing focused on was a recently released and highly notorious issue of Crime Suspense Stories that featured a decapitated woman on its cover. William Gaines, the owner of EC Comics, who had single-handedly revolutionized horror, sci-fi, and crime genres in the medium, up until that point, was questioned, and this issue became the focal point of that questioning. He was asked if he thought the image was in good taste. He responded with, "Yes, I do," for the cover of a horror comic, and then gave his reasoning. But the senators were relentless, and eventually the Comics Magazine Association was formed, along with the Comics Code Authority, a means in which publishers self-regulated their titles to avoid government censorship. Horror and crime comics took a big hit. They either had to censor their work, or they were blacklisted from all major distribution and sales agencies. So pretty much destroyed EC Comics, who would only be survived by a single publication of theirs, Mad Magazine. So all in all, this is a cover that acted as a catalyst and took center stage during the Senate hearings that would eventually establish the Comics Code Authority, which would largely shape the histories of some of the most iconic characters, including Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And it set the stage for two eras that would abide by censorship rules, largely enforcing the low art or immature misconceptions about comics for years to come. Thankfully, a lot of that has changed. Alright, there we have it, friends. What other iconic comic book covers do you think have changed the comic book industry forever? Give us a shout in those comments below and share your thoughts with us. If you dug this video, you guys know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to Top 10 Nerd and become part of the Nerd Squad if you haven't already, and be sure to hit that bell notification so you never miss another nerdy list. In the meantime though, thanks for watching, friends. I'll catch you all in the next video.